They say that in Sparta, the soil itself rejected the footsteps of a man who returned from battle alive. There were no trials, no judges, and no written laws needed to condemn him. The city didn't need to speak a word to destroy a soul, it simply stopped seeing him. This is the story of a man who survived the greatest sacrifice in history, only to realize that breathing in Sparta was far more painful than dying in the dust of Thermopylae. This is not a story of cowardice. It is a story of a man caught in the machinery of a culture that demanded his erasure. The year is 480 BC. The air in Sparta is thin, cold, and tastes of iron. A man walks through the narrow, stone-paved streets. He is dressed in the same crimson cloak as every other man. His sandals strike the hard ground with a rhythm that feels out of place. It is a heartbeat in a graveyard. No one looks at him. No one nods. No one offers the customary greeting of a brother in arms. He is a soldier, yet he is treated as a void. When he moves, the crowd parts. It is not an organized motion. It is a reflex, like water flowing around a stone. His name is Aristodemus. He is a Spartan. Or at least, he was until he stepped back across the city limits. He is the man who walked out of the hot gates of Thermopylae. He is the man who lived when 300 others chose to turn their bodies into shields for Greece. The city does not ask how he survived. They do not care about the orders he was given, or the fact that he followed them with the precision of a machine. Sparta has a way of dealing with the uncomfortable. They do not execute, that would be a mercy. Instead, they strip away your reality. Aristodemus is still a citizen on paper. He owns land. He has a home. He can walk into the assembly. But he is a ghost who casts a shadow. Every time he enters a room, the conversation does not stop. It simply shifts. It flows around him, through him, and over him. The silence directed at him is loud enough to shatter bone. He stands in the marketplace. He is hungry. He reaches for a loaf of bread. The merchant looks through his eyes as if he is made of glass. He gets no bread. He is thirsty. He stands by the public fountain. When he steps forward, the other men pull their cloaks tight and turn their backs. He is a living contamination. The city has collectively decided that he is already dead. And the most terrifying part? He is still breathing. He wakes up every morning, feels the cold floor, sees the sun rising over the mountains, and realizes the nightmare has not ended. It has only just begun. The city isn't punishing his body. They are slowly, methodically, consuming his existence while he is still trapped inside it. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The name arrived before he did. Not a title of honor, not a mark of service. It was a scar carved into his reputation by the collective tongue of the city. Xerxes. The trembler. The man who shook. In the Agoge, the brutal training ground where Spartan boys were forged into steel, this word was never spoken as a possibility. It was a phantom, a cautionary tale used to ensure that when the time came, a soldier would choose the blade over the retreat. To the Spartans, Xerxes was more than a label. It was a social death sentence. It was a classification for those who had failed the ultimate test, the test of total, final, and absolute sacrifice. In the eyes of his peers, Aristodemus hadn't just survived a battle, he had committed a crime against the very philosophy of their existence. If a Spartan could return, then the myth of the unyielding warrior was not a law of nature. It was a choice. And that was the most dangerous idea of all. The city required the legend of the 300 to be pure. It needed the hot gates to be a monument of perfect, unadulterated death. Aristodemus was the impurity in that monument. He was the piece of debris that the ocean had failed to wash away. He walked through the city, and every eye that avoided him was a reaffirmation of the Spartan code. They did not need a trial. They did not need a jury to deliberate his fate. The culture itself functioned as the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. He felt the weight of their gaze, or the deliberate lack of it, every single hour. He could sit at the communal mess hall, a required obligation for every citizen, and be the only man in the room. He ate the same black broth. He chewed the same barley. But he was eating in a vacuum. He was a man surrounded by voices, yet he existed in total, deafening isolation. He realized then that the punishment was not about his past actions. It was about his present endurance. The city wanted him to snap. They wanted him to choose the same end as the others, to find a dark corner and end his own life, because that would have been a clean conclusion. That would have fit the narrative. But he remained. He showed up to the assembly. He stood in the ranks during drills, even if no one would stand next to him. His existence was an insult to their comfort, and his survival was an indictment of their cruelty. He was the man who refused to become the story they wanted him to be. Isolation in Sparta was not an accident. It was a finely tuned machine, a calculated atmospheric pressure applied to the human soul until it either shattered or petrified. Aristodemus lived within this architecture every day. There were no walls built to keep him in, yet there was nowhere he could go. There were no chains on his wrists, yet he was bound tighter than any prisoner. The mechanism functioned through silence. It was a weapon of incredible precision. When he walked into the communal hall for the evening meal, the sound of spoons against wooden bowls did not cease. The men did not stop their laughter. They did not pause their tactical discussions. They simply acted as if he was part of the furniture, a structural element of the room that held no consciousness. He was a piece of scenery that did not move. He was air. He understood the logic. The city needed to believe that dishonor was an infectious disease. If you stood too close to it, you might catch it. If you spoke to it, you might be tainted by its proximity. So, they maintained a physical buffer zone. Wherever Aristodemus stood, a radius of empty space followed him. It was a vacuum of human connection. He could reach out his hand and touch nothing but the cold, stagnant air of his own exclusion. He began to notice the small things. The way a man would shift his weight to avoid brushing his shoulder in a crowded corridor. The way a woman would look at the ground when he passed, not out of modesty, but out of a desperate need to avoid acknowledging that he was still a man. These were not random acts. They were ritualized, standardized, and collective. Every citizen of Sparta knew their role in this performance. They were all complicit in the erasure of one man. Aristodemus realized that he was being studied. He was the subject of an experiment in human endurance. Could a man exist without community? Could a soldier live without the validation of his brothers? Every night, he lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting for a breakdown that refused to arrive. He was proving something they did not want to admit, that a man could survive the gaze of an entire city. He was becoming something harder than they had ever trained him to be. He was becoming a ghost who refused to haunt. The history books are not written for the truth, they are written for the narrative. 50 years after the smoke cleared at the hot gates, the accounts began to fracture. Historians would later record two versions of why Aristodemus was not among the dead. The first was a matter of orders, a severe eye infection, a king's command, a forced departure to save a life that was meant to be preserved for another day. The second version was uglier. It whispered of a messenger's errand used as a convenient excuse for delay. Two versions. Both existing in the same text. Both treated with the same cold uncertainty. For Aristodemus, this ambiguity was not a salvation, it was the sharpening of the blade. If the city had been certain of his cowardice, they might have killed him. If they had been certain of his heroism, they would have celebrated him. But the gray space in between? That was where the real punishment lived. It allowed the city to project whatever darkness they needed onto his name. If someone needed a reason to hate him, they chose the version where he fled. If someone needed a reason to look away, they chose the version where he was sick. The uncertainty meant that he could never be vindicated. He could never point to a legal document or a commander's seal and say, "I obeyed." The system was designed to keep the guilt floating, permanently unmoored, so that it could never be settled. It was a tactical, psychological victory for the state. By refusing to agree on what he had done, they made sure he was responsible for everything they feared. He was the living embodiment of the what if. What if a man chooses to live? What if the code isn't absolute? What if the king is fallible? Aristodemus was the physical proof that these questions were real, and that was a threat to the foundation of the Spartan state. Every time he stepped out of his house, he was a walking contradiction. He was a man who had obeyed the law, yet had been destroyed by the culture. He was a man who had survived the most brutal battle in history, yet found his own home to be a landscape of far more sophisticated cruelty. He was the survivor who had been denied the right to be a human being, trapped in a narrative that refused to let him be anything other than a warning. 12 months. A year of sunrises that brought no warmth and sunsets that offered no peace. Aristodemus lived through the seasons, a silent witness to a city that thrived on a singular, claustrophobic belief. He did not leave. He did not seek refuge in another state. He did not take the quick, cold exit that others, like Pantites, had chosen to escape the sting of shame. He simply endured. He was a man stripped of his shadow, performing the motions of life in a city that had already finished his eulogy. He walked the path to the communal barracks. He stood in the ranks. He maintained his equipment, polishing the bronze until it shone with a mirror-like finish that reflected nothing but his own isolation. He was an object lesson in endurance. Every night, the low hum of conversation would fill the hall. It was a sound of belonging, a communal rhythm that he was physically present for but conceptually excluded from. He was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that no one wanted to finish. The other men ate, laughed, and drank, their lives interlocking like the shields in their phalanx. They formed a wall, and he was the gap in that wall, the place where the structure was weakest. Yet, he did not break. The psychological weight was designed to crush him. It was meant to make him desperate, to make him reach for a blade and end his own existence just to find the quiet of the grave. That was the resolution the system craved. A dead man was a contained story. A dead man could be labeled, categorized, and placed in the archives of history. But a man who survived, a man who continued to breathe, walk, and exist? That was a glitch in the code. He began to realize that his presence was doing something to them. The tension in the room wasn't just his own, it was theirs. They were uncomfortable because he was the evidence of their own fragility. If they could break a man so thoroughly and he still wouldn't die, what did that say about their strength? They were watching him, waiting for the crack. And in that mutual, unspoken waiting, the power dynamics began to shift. He was no longer just the victim of the system, he was the ghost that haunted the halls of the living. He survived the isolation not because he was strong, but because he was already dead to their world, and you cannot kill what has already surrendered its existence to the void. The year 479 BC brought the dust of a new invasion. The Persian army returned to the soil of Greece, a massive, grinding machine of empire. The Greeks gathered at Plataea, the largest assembly of hoplites ever seen. 5,000 Spartans stood in their bronze, their crimson cloaks stark against the gray horizon. Aristodemus stood with them. He was not invited, but the state needed bodies. The city that had stripped him of his humanity still claimed the right to his life. He was a ghost in the ranks. Men fought and died around him, and he fought through the mechanical motions of a man who had already settled his debts with life. The omens were bad. The priests slaughtered the animals, their hands shaking as they read the entrails. The signs demanded a delay. The Spartan line, trained for absolute obedience, held firm. They stood in the heat, the Persian arrows falling like black rain against their shields. The discipline was total. No man moved. No man broke the line. Aristodemus did not move to command. He did not look to his leaders. He looked into the space where the Persian line was thickest. He was not fighting for the glory of Sparta. He was not fighting to protect the home that had erased him. He was fighting for the one thing he had been denied, a conclusion. He broke the phalanx. He stepped out of the protective wall of shields, the bronze of his armor catching the brutal, unforgiving sun. He walked at first, then he ran. He moved alone across the 200 meters of blood-soaked ground that separated the two worlds. He was a single man charging a sea of iron. The Persians, confused by the lone warrior, swarmed him. He fought in a frenzy that the history books would later struggle to define. It was not the tactical, measured movement of a disciplined Spartan. It was the desperate, singular violence of a man who was trading his breath for a legacy. He killed. He kept killing until the sheer weight of the enemy forced him down. His charge shamed the remaining Spartans into motion. The priests, seeing the line break, declared the omens suddenly favorable. The army surged. The battle was won because one man had refused to wait for permission to die. He had achieved the spectacular, suicidal end that his city had demanded. But when the dust settled and the victory was tallied, the trap closed one final time. The Spartans voted on the bravest man. They chose others, men who had fought with the safety of the line, men who had fought while hoping to return home. They denied Aristodemus. They called his sacrifice recklessness. They called it a lack of discipline. He had done everything. He had returned, he had endured, and he had died with a spectacle that no historian could ignore. He had forced them to see him, and even then, they chose to close their eyes. He died on his own terms, but the city died on theirs, by refusing to acknowledge that a man could ever be forgiven. They erased his name from the victory monuments. They left his bones in an unmarked trench. They thought they had finally buried the truth. But in the quiet of the graveyard, the story of the man who survived the system became the only thing that lasted. Sparta did not kill him. They only proved that they were the kind of city that could never afford to let a man like that truly live. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.